Hi everyone, welcome to episode 15 of ARM Template Masterclass. Today we're going to have a look at how you can use deployment scripts in your templates. Deployment scripts are a new feature and they're actually currently still in preview, but what they allow you to do is to run a script as part of your ARM template. So either something in PowerShell or CLI to do something that ARM templates can't do. It allows you to write some PowerShell or CLI and have ARM run it as part of your deployment, and report on its status, and fail if it errors, and so on. So why would you want to use deployment scripts? The most likely reason is because you're trying to do something that there isn't an ARM resource for. So some of the most common examples here are creating an Azure AD user as part of your deployment. There's no ARM resource to do that. Similarly, if you wanted to create a certificate in a key vault, there's not an ARM resource to do that. You can create a secret, but you can't create a certificate for some reason. So maybe you want to script something like that. You might also want to do something that isn't in Azure at all. So maybe you want to reach out to an external system as part of your deployment. Maybe you've got a system for allocating IP addresses that you want to reach out to and grab an IP to use for your deployment. ARM obviously doesn't have a resource for that, so you can use a deployment script to reach out and do those sort of things. Deployment scripts also allow you to look at doing data plane operations in Azure, which again, there's no ARM resource for. So things like creating files in blob storage, creating files in Azure Data Lake, uploading a zip file into your Azure web app. All those sort of data operations that you might want to do as a deployment to get your resources ready to do whatever they want to do, but you can't achieve with ARM templates. So deployment scripts allow you to do that as long as you can write the PowerShell or the CLI to do that, or find a sample that does what you want, then you can have it run this as part of your deployment. So how do deployment scripts actually work? Well, behind the scenes, what's going on is when you add a deployment script to your template and you run it, what you're getting is an Azure container instance and a storage account being created. If you're not familiar with them, Azure container instances are Microsoft's implementation of containers as a standalone service. So no orchestrator, no Kubernetes or anything like that. It's just a container. You can give it an image, it'll run, and then it'll stop. And so ACI is really great for sort of ad hoc workloads, burst workloads, those sort of things. And so that's what's going on when you run a deployment script. You're spinning up a container instance, which has a container which has got the PowerShell and CLI installed, as well as the Azure libraries. And you're passing in your script that you want to run along with any arguments. And that's run using the container instance. Once it's run, the container instance stops, and the ARM fabric checks that container to make sure it's run successfully or not, and pulls any errors or any outputs out of it, and then moves on to the next part of your script. A second piece to this is the use of managed identity. So a prerequisite to using deployment scripts is you need a user assigned managed identity. So this is an identity that you can assign to resources in Azure, and you're assigning it to the actual ACI instance when it runs. This means that it can use that identity to access any Azure resources that you want to use. So if you are doing something like creating an Azure AD user, or uploading some files to Azure storage, or creating a Key Vault certificate, that will be done with that identity. So that needs to exist before you run your deployment. It can't be part of your deployment script. And it needs to have permission to do whatever it is you want your deployment scripts to do. Now, obviously, that only applies if you're talking to resources in Azure. If you're talking to external resources that you own or another company, managed identity is not going to be used. You're going to have to supply any identity details as part of your deployment script. You still have to have the managed identity configured for your deployment script anyway, but it won't be used. Now, the storage account and the ACI instance are by default created when you run the deployment script. It's created for you, and it will also automatically clean them up for you when you're done. So if you take the default option, it will handle the life cycle of that. You don't really have to worry about it. It will get cleaned up for you. However, if you want to, you can also configure it to use an existing storage account and ACI instance. We're not going to do that in this demo, but if you're interested in doing that, have a look at the documentation. Now, before we look at how we actually create a deployment script, there are a few things to be aware of. Firstly, it's really important that you keep your scripts idempotent. There is potential that when your template gets rerun at a later point, it's going to rerun your deployment script. With the rest of your ARM resources, if you run them multiple times, you will get the same result. It's not going to do anything different. If the resources already exist, it's just going to carry on and leave them as is. So you need to make sure that your deployment script does the same. If your script's going to run differently, depending on whether it's the first time it's been run or whether it's going to be, or whether it's the second time or so on, or even worse, it's going to error when it runs the second time, then that's going to cause you problems. You need to make sure your scripts are acting in an idempotent way. But conversely, your script also isn't going to run every time. So by default, deployment scripts only get run a second time if something has changed. So either you're passing in a different parameter, you've updated the script somehow, or you've changed something in the force update property. So this is just a property of a resource deployment that you can put an arbitrary value in to trigger it to rerun your script. So if you wanted it to run every single time you run your template, you could do something like put the date in there, or the date and time. But you can use this to ensure that your script is actually run when you want it to, rather than being run once and then never again. The image you're using to actually run the deployment script gets updated fairly regularly, but it takes about 30 days between when a new version of PowerShell or CLI libraries are released and them getting into the image. So don't rely on brand new features being available in the image, because they might not be. Related to that, there isn't currently any support for custom images, so you've got to use the image that Microsoft provide for you. You can't bring your own image. And finally, this might seem obvious, but because you're spinning up an ACI instance and a storage account to do this, and it's in your account, then you are going to be paying for the use of that. Now, if your scripts are very short, the amount of money for that is going to be very, very small. Both storage accounts and ACI charge per minute, and so you're not going to be paying massive amounts for those, but it's just worth being aware that that is a cost you are going to have to bear. Okay, so now we know how they work. Let's go and have a look at setting one up. Okay, so we've created an ARM template here that's going to be using a deployment script. And what we're going to be doing in this template is pretty simple. We're creating a key vault, and then we want to create a certificate in that key vault. Can't do that with an ARM resource. There's no ARM resource for creating certificates, so we're going to use a PowerShell script to create that for us using the AZ PowerShell commandlet. So this is a reasonably long template, but don't be discouraged by that. A lot of that is just in terms of the parameters it takes, and a lot of those are actually optional. So we've got a few parameters set up in this template, and then we come to our resources, and there's really only two things. The first thing we're doing is we're creating a key vault, and the key vault's pretty standard. The only sort of different stuff we're doing here is the access policies. We are granting firstly an object ID that I set, which is my account, just so I have access. And then the second one down here was granting access to the key vault to the managed identity that we're using for the deployment script. And this was passed in as a parameter, so the full ID of the managed identity was passed in here, and we're granting that access to create certificates. That's pretty much it for the actual key vault. And then we move on to our deployment script. So as always, this is just another ARM resource, this time of the type Microsoft Resources /deployment scripts. We give it some of the usual properties like location, dependencies, and so on, and then we get into the actual custom ones for the deployment script. So the first thing here is we're assigning the identity for it to run as. As I mentioned, you need a managed identity to use, so we're giving that the ID, which is passed in as a parameter. Then we're giving it the kind, so we want to use Azure PowerShell. And then we get into the properties section where we're defining how our script runs. So first we've got that force update tag that I mentioned. And I'm passing in a parameter called UTC now, which is actually just using the UTC now function to get the current date time. So that will ensure that this script runs every time. I give it a version of the AZ PowerShell commandlets I want, which is 3. And I give it a timeout. So this is how long I will allow my script to run before ARM automatically times out and throws an error. So this will stop your script running for forever and costing you a lot of money in ACI. So it's always good to put a timeout on there and make it reasonable. Then we get into our script content. So we've got the actual script content section where we're defining our script. And this is just a normal PowerShell script. There's nothing specific to ARM about this. So we can set up the script. We've got some parameters we're passing in there in that section, and then the actual script. You'll notice that I'm doing some checks here to look for an existing certificate. So this is how I'm ensuring that my script is idempotent. So I check to see if it's a certificate, and if there is, I leave it alone. If there isn't, I create it. So if I run that multiple times, this should give you the same result. Then above the script context section, we've got our arguments section. So this allows us to pass arguments into the script. And so I'm using the format function here just to make this easier to read. And then we pass in the parameters like you would with any PowerShell script, dash parameter name and then value. And then we've got the values at the end, which are coming from the parameters we passed into the ARM template. And this just defines the key vault name to run against, the name of the certificate we want to create, and the subject name that we're going to use on the certificate. All these were passed in as parameters to the ARM template. Then at the end of the template, we have 2 additional ones. We have a cleanup preference. This determines when Azure will clean up the ACI and storage account that were created for running your resource. So there's a few options. You can use always, which means that will clean up as soon as your script is run anytime. You can do it on success, so that it leaves them behind if you have an error. This can be quite useful for debugging. Or you can have on expiration, which means it will remove them when you get to the end of your retention interval, which is the next property we'll look at. I've got it on there for on expiration in a minute just because I want to show you what happens when it runs, so I don't want them to get deleted. But normally you can either do this always or on success if you want to debug things. The last option here is the retention interval. So when we run the deployment in a minute, you'll see that actually there are 3 resources created. There is the storage account, the ACI instance, and then there is a deployment script instance, which gives you some of the data about how your deployment script ran. If you use the always or on success option for cleanup preference, then it will delete the ACI and storage account as soon as your job finishes. However, the deployment script object will hang around. It will hang around until it reaches this retention interval, and then it will get removed. So you can set this to see how long you want to keep that data around. If you're doing what I'm doing here and you use on expiration as your cleanup preference, then that will also affect the ACI instance and storage. They will get cleaned up at the end of the retention interval as well. So I'm keeping those for 1 day. That's all there is to the template itself. I'm going to go ahead and run that from the command line. There's nothing special there. We're just using our new AZ resource group deployment command again to do that. It'll take a while to run, so we'll come back in a minute when that has finished. Okay, so here's our resource group in the portal, and we've got a few resources in here now. Firstly, the deployment script identity there is my managed identity. I created that manually before we did this, and it has got contributor rights on this resource group. It doesn't need to sit within the resource group you're deploying. It can sit anywhere. It just needs the rights to be able to do whatever your script is going to do. Then we've got our key vault, which was created for us. And if we have a look in that key vault and have a look at the actual certificates section, we can see that it has created a certificate for us based on that script. Go back to the resource group, and we've got a few other resources that are part of the deployment script operation. So as I mentioned, it's going to create a ACI instance and a storage account for us, and these two are here. If you had your cleanup preference set to get rid of these, you wouldn't see these anymore. I just kept them there for reference. And if you do find you're having issues with your script, you can actually, as I said, use the on success option to keep them around, and you can get some additional debug data from the ACI instance. So you can have a look in here and look at the container section, and you can see the events, you can see the container log, and you can see the properties, which also include the actual commands you passed into the script, so you can validate those. So that can be quite helpful for debugging. Finally, we've got the deployment script object, which is created to show you the details of that run. So if we click on that, and you can see some more useful information in here. It gives you the logs again. It gives you the details of the storage account and container instance it was used, the timeouts, and so on. And you can have a look at things like the content and inputs, which will show us the arguments that were passed in and the script that was run. So again, some more useful debug information there. Because I set my retention interval to 1 day, in a day's time, it's going to delete the deployment script, the container instance, and the storage account. So all I'll be left with is the actual key vault and the identity I used to get that. And that's how deployment scripts work. Hopefully that made sense and you'll find that useful. If you've got any questions or problems, please feel free to add them below the video and I'll be happy to get back to you. All the examples from this session are on GitHub and I'll link them beneath the video as well, along with some links to the official documentation on deployment scripts. Next week, we're going to be having a look at how version control can be useful for your workflow when creating ARM templates. So hopefully I'll see you then. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.